the game window of your Unity editor. That's where it'll list the batches here, tries there, and your shadow casters right there. Alrighty, and what is a batch, you might ask? Well, first I have to tell you what a draw call is. A draw call is essentially a call to the GPU. You tell it to, say, draw a triangle. There's a draw call. And a batch is a group of those draw calls. So my avatar would be one batch. If you have a different kind of shader on, say like an outline shader or a fur shader, you might have more than one pass on your avatar. And what that does, it actually increases the amount of batches. The more batches you have, the greater the performance costs, especially with more players. And what can you do to reduce batches? Well, everything that you'll learn here today. Occlusion calling, texture atlasing, using viz leafs, combining the meshes and optimizing your meshes and optimizing your lighting. Occlusion calling. Calling means not to render something, and occlusion is when something blocks something else. In the case of occlusion calling, it's your vision. Occlusion calling will cause objects outside of or objects blocked by another object to not render. So if this wall behind me, the things on the other side of that wall are not rendered. The things backstage are completely unrendered for me, so thus my computer doesn't have to worry about them. There are some settings that you can change in occlusion calling to get better performance, as well as reduce the file size of the occlusion data. Because when you do bake this into your world, it will increase the file size of your world. The smallest occluder setting, well, my pen decided to stop working. Oh, there it goes. The smallest occluder setting there. Fucking screw the pen. The smallest occluder setting is the minimum size for an object to occlude. So if you have a large object, that'll block your vision and things won't render behind it, while a smaller object won't write to the occlusion data, so it'll still render objects behind it even if you put it right up in your face. The reason why you don't want to have just everything in your world be an occluder is because of that file size. You don't want to make your occlusion data be something like 500 megabytes. The smallest hole setting is the minimum size of a hole on a mesh. Essentially, if you have a little hole in a mesh and you look through it, if that setting is wrong, it'll act as if there's one big mesh in front of you without a hole and not render anything past it. The backface threshold will discard data in bad camera positions, and what that means is essentially when the occlusion calling is checking for camera positions, if there's one behind a mesh looking through that see-through side of a mesh where you see through it, it'll discard that data and save you on your file size. But it makes the occlusion calling take longer to bake, so that's the trade-off. And texture atlasing. Texture atlasing sounds scary, but honestly, it's really easy. It's just taking multiple textures and combining them down into one, and this reduces the overall material count in a world, which reduces batches. You can essentially take every single material in a world and condense it into one single material, and you will have an amazing optimized world. The trade-offs is texture resolution, because when you have that many things packed into one single texture, it has to shrink some of your textures down. If you need any help atlasing, there's some Blender plugins that can help you out, as well as an asset called Super Combiner that may or may not work. It's been hit or miss when I've used it. I would suggest Blender. And mesh combining. Now, mesh combining is the practice of taking multiple meshes of the same material and combining them into one mesh. This drastically reduces the batches in the scene, because now all of those GPU calls are now in one batch. But sometimes you might want to avoid combining your entire scene into one single mesh, because it could lower the occlusion calling performance, as well as you could end up drawing too many triangles. Say you combine your entire world and now you're drawing 3 million meshes all at once. So some programs that can help you combine meshes, again, Blender, it's really easy there. You just join the meshes in. And there's another Unity asset store asset that I use personally. It's called Mesh Combine Studio. None of my worlds would be possible without it, honestly. It does everything I need automatically. It even combines meshes on a cell-based grid to avoid that problem of combining your entire scene into one single mesh. And visleafs. So what a visleaf is a collection of visible surfaces within an area. They're defined by what could be potentially visible when standing in the center of a given room. They're best used in interior spaces rather than exterior. And it's more of a kind of workflow rather than something that's just built into Unity itself. To use them, you essentially combine your meshes in such a way that they'll call out in groups when you use Unity's occlusion calling. Say you have a room with 2 doors that lead to other rooms and a window that looks outside. When you're in this room, the only things you should be rendering are what's in that room, as well as outside, and not the adjacent rooms with the doors closed. If you combined the entire mesh of the whole scene, you're rendering that everything at once. While if you use the visleaf workflow, you would separate each of those rooms into separate meshes to ensure that each adjacent room is not rendered when you're inside of another one. Now, dynamic lighting. Mostly, I would suggest avoiding this, but in a lot of cases, this can make avatars in your world look great. But it really, really has a performance cost. A scene with 300 batches and 300,000 triangles with one dynamic light could increase to over 1,000 batches and 1,000,000 triangles with just 2 more point lights added to the scene. The reason this happens is because VRChat uses what's called forward rendering. And what forward rendering does is, for every single new light that's added to a scene, there's another pass on every single object that light affects. That increases the batches drastically. In fact, it can increase it exponentially. But there are a couple things you can do to optimize dynamic lightings if you still need to use it. You can just use only one light, just the directional light is what I would suggest. Reduce the shadow resolution. I usually use low resolution soft shadows if I'm using dynamic lighting, as the soft shadows hides the aliasing of the low resolution while still looking nice. But if you really need to use multiple lights, like point lights and such, Unity does have a built-in system to only render a specific number of them at a time. But please space them out, as if you have them clustered in one area, it'll cause flickering because of that mentioned system where Unity can only render a couple of them at a time. And baked lighting. Baked lighting is the process of pre-calculating the lighting information in the scene. This has the potential to drastically improve performance, but it does have its own fallbacks, such as no dynamic shadows for characters and avatars. It increases the file size of the world, can have a long time depending on you better have ambient occlusion in your world, which increases visual quality, and the lighting itself can be extremely accurate. Say you have a room with just a window with light coming through that window. Under dynamic lighting, it would just be a spotlight of that window while the rest of the room is dark. With baked lighting, you can bake in the ambient occlusion as well as the ambient bounces of that sun coming through the window to light up the whole room just off of the floor. And light probes. Light probes are very important. If you've ever been to a VRChat world that has baked lighting and your avatar is just black or gray and it won't respond to the lighting in the world, that's because the world creator did not use light probes. These probes allow dynamic objects to be lit in a scene that has baked lighting. Without these light probes, avatars will not follow the world's lighting. There's an asset on GitHub called Light Probe Volume, which can place light probes in your world automatically, and it even follows the floor collider. There's no excuse not to have these with an asset that helps you do it that quick. What essentially these light probes do is it's a bunch of little game objects spread about your scene that calculate the lighting on them as almost kind of like a low-resolution cube map. And then when your character walks nearby these, it'll take 3 of them, blend them together, and use them on your character as the lighting. And reflection probes. Reflection probes are similar to the light probes, but these probes instead control how Unity displays smooth materials. Without a reflection probe, smooth materials will seem flat. If you want people's avatars to display properly, especially protogens and other hard surface materials, use at least one reflection probe stretched across the whole scene. Ideally, you'll want to have multiple reflection probes in your scene so that people's reflections respond more appropriately to the area they're in. But if you want to save on file size, just use one. And don't make these any higher than 512 resolution. It really doesn't make a difference when you set these to 1024 and 2K and 4K. It just takes up file size. And that's the end of it. Thank you all for coming to my panel. You all have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the con.